This evening we'll study the villains. Based on our opening reading, on the face of it they appear innocent. For one thing, we know very little about them, apart from what we've read and a few verses elsewhere. But by the end of the study, you'll see that half a dozen men brought evil into a near paradise and led millions to die in the flood, despite God's patience, and despite him sending preachers and prophets who fought to change the inevitable. We'll see the similarities between the antediluvian world with our modern age. These two latter days, even though 4,000 years apart, mirror one another. But first of all, let's examine their world and see yet another example of God's forbearance, his tolerance of mankind. Adam and Eve were punished for their sin, and we know the curses. Plus they were driven out of the Garden of Eden, a form of paradise. Despite that, they remained in a partial paradise, in many ways far better than our present world. For a start, we know their lifespan was considerable compared with ours. There's a good argument they enjoyed a temperate climate, without seasons. The oxygen content was higher, another benefit. Plus man had no need to fear the animals. As Genesis 1:29 and 30 tells us, all the animals were vegetarians prior to the flood. Another major benefit was the protection from the magma, the molten rock. It's self-evident from the picture that the magma is at the centre, and then there's a black line, which is the rock strata. Then the waters above that, which were apparently 10 miles deep. And then the orange is, of course, the Earth's crust, the seabed, and the land. So these waters were sealed between the earth crust. They were trapped. Until the waters were released, this split in the Earth's inner crust didn't cause the devastation the world now suffers. Once that lower rock strata fractured, it was the start of the age of volcanoes, earthquakes, and tsunamis. Major quakes, we have more than one a month, and great quakes, magnitude 8, once a year. We know it's common for some people to blame God for these disasters, but we can see mankind has only itself to blame. So, we see God in his mercy provided Adam and Eve and their children with a far safer world than we live in. But as usual, sin ruined it. Just as I suggested in the first part in February, I believe the peace and prosperity was partly to blame for this lack of interest in God during this pre-flood period. The lives were good, and they questioned the need for God. Bottom left, we have the heroes and the villains. On the right are the descendants of Eve, the sons of God, and on the left, the seed of the serpent, the sons of Cain. Cain's list finishes with the three children of Lamech, Jabal, Jubal, and Tubal-Cain. So does this mean there were no 9th or 10th generations? Not at all, as we'll see later. Adam was at the top of the list, so a brief thought about him. He let us down, didn't he? But would we, as Christadelphians, have been any different? I like to think that none of us in our community would have taken the fruit, but if not one of us, there's always one who knows better, such as Cain, and it only took one to cause the downfall. The other aspect is being wise after the event. We know of all the pain and suffering that followed, but Adam had no idea. He had no possible way of comprehending the terrible diseases, wars, and all the other horrors that he was bringing to mankind. I like to think if he had foreknowledge, he would have found some way to guard the tree. For this reason, I believe he was God-fearing and taught both his children and 7 generations afterwards to serve God, and this included Noah's father. So, if these villains brought an action against me for slander, how could I defend myself, apart from knowing I'm permitted to slander the dead? I think there's 3 reasons. Firstly, we know the meaning of a biblical name is almost always a statement about the person, and some of the villains had names which are significant in establishing their guilt. Next, their careers are a clue. Why does God record their jobs, their careers? If they'd been butchers, bakers and candlestick makers, I doubt this would be on record. There are no wasted words in the scripture, so why list their careers unless they're significant? Thirdly, we share their sinful disposition, so we're able to recognize evil. We know human nature, we know evil works. We don't need to be wicked to know that Cain and Lamech and Nimrod each had an arrogance that was colossal. So it's necessary to think how they thought and consider what we would do if we didn't have a conscience. Between them, these men were responsible for almost every rotten thing that's duplicated in our world. We live in a time that is so evil it sickens us. Mankind dreams up wickednesses and cruelties that is almost beyond belief. But I'm sure it's the same then, because God saw that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. Cain, he was the start of the rot. If we had any doubts he was evil, John confirms it in his first epistle in chapter 3 verse 12. Because his works were evil and his brother's righteous. We know of the murder of his brother Abel, so let's pick up the story after. In verse 16 we read, he went out from the presence of God. By contrast, in the final verse, verse 26 of this chapter, others did not. Then began men to call upon the name of Yahweh. So here we see the 2 parallels, the evil ignoring God and the good seeking him. Verse 17, Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bare Enoch. And he builded a city and called the name of the city after the name of his son Enoch. A dramatic career change. From gardener to civil engineer. Why? Well, he had no choice, as we see in verse 12. When thou tillest the ground, it shall not henceforth yield unto thee her strength. So why is this new career recorded in the Bible? Sounds innocent, and it could have been. The city was named after his son Enoch. Enoch means dedicated. But dedicated to who or what? In the case of good Enoch, it's likely he was dedicated to God. But for Cain, I'm sure Cain dedicated the city to God and Mammon, which is impossible, as we know. But I hope to prove this was in his mind. So in Jude 11 we read, Woe unto them, for they have gone in the way of Cain, and ran greedily after the error of Balaam for reward, and perished in the gainsaying of Kor. Here, Jude was writing to the ecclesias, warning them of 2 examples of false brethren. We can ignore Balaam's example and simply link the 2 phrases I've highlighted, the way of Cain and the gainsaying of Kor. Korah, Dathan and Abiram did exactly as Cain did. They challenged the way God should be worshipped. Korah disputed Aaron's right to be the priest and aspired to be the priest himself. When Cain made his sacrifice, it wasn't because he'd misunderstood what he was to offer. He chose to offer a sacrifice from his produce and not the animal sacrifice God demanded, which required the spilling of blood. It's obvious Cain was a man who wanted to worship God, but on his own terms. And Jude is telling us Cain wanted to set up his own apostate form of worship. He has all the signs of a man who wanted to build the Vatican and rule as Pope. Well, I wonder if there may be more to this city. City means eyes open, and perhaps Cain's eyes were open to another thought, a way to make money. There are notorious cities recorded in the Bible. Sodom and Gomorrah immediately spring to mind. Earlier, I mentioned the parallel with our time. London is also nicknamed Sin City, for reasons I doubt I need to expand upon. I don't think there's any doubt that Cain was a clever man, maybe the first entrepreneur, and not just for building a city, but for the second motive I hinted at. Cain means gain, and I believe this is significant. I think he called together a group of people, probably the most notorious in the area: the publicans, as in innkeepers, the harlots, witches, wizards, magicians, casino owners, obviously whatever gambling was popular back then, plus the fortune tellers and soothsayers. He made a proposition to make them wealthy. I'm building a city, he told them. With each of you, I'll agree on a long-term lease for the prime properties, just inside the gate. Instead of being scattered around the countryside, as you are now, relying on passing trade, you'll all be located in one area, which will quickly be known as the Pleasure Palace. He could have called it Soho. In addition, he continued, I'll build flats, I'll build penthouses on the city walls, and sell them to the wealthiest of nobles. So you'll all be gathered together in one place. Their money and you. So who'll be the first to sign up? Can you picture the contrast with the small group of pre-flood Christadelphians living in quiet villages? We're reminded that many years later, Lot was safe while he lived in his tent, but when he moved to Sodom, his life was almost lost. He was God-fearing and took no part in the activities, but it's never wise to be closely linked with the evils of the world. Even when he did leave, the angels had to drag him out as he tried to save others of his family who refused to leave. Next on the list is Lamech. His name means powerful. I think of him and Nimrod being similar. The same arrogance, the same disdain for everyone else, the same blatant disregard for God. Also the same response as Cain to anything that upset him. Kill them. Clearly violence was the answer. He was the first polygamist. He had what some men fantasize, the trophy wife. Ada, her name means ornament. He would take her to the swankiest nightclubs in Enoch, Cain City, and show her off to his friends. And then afterwards back home to a late supper, prepared by his other wife, Zillah, whose job it was to ensure his household was perfection. It's his boast we know him best for. He called his wives in and made a speech. We've already read this, so let's just compare the King James Version with the translation in the Revised Version, where he's boasting what he intends doing, not what he has done. The young man was obviously Enoch, and later we'll turn our attention to him and connect these two men. Before that, it's certain there was already persecution. The name of Lamech's father, Methusael, means that they are destroyed who are of God. Seems he was expecting to dedicate his life to killing God's people. Centuries later, we recall the intention of Haman to kill all the Jews, simply because of his hatred of one Jew, Mordecai. And I believe we can draw comparisons here with Gog. I won't read from the screen, but if you're interested, maybe jot down the two references for later. It's not conclusive proof, but the Bible uses the same Hebrew word for Haman's device to destroy the Jews and the evil thought that will or has come into the mind of Gog. So is the thought a contrivance, as you can see there in green, not just to steal their resources, to take a spoil, but annihilate the entire race. We know anti-Semitism is universal and growing, plus the majority of the UN is anti-Israel. So we'll go use some action, some infringement by Israel as an excuse to justify bringing the nations together to punish the Jews. Enoch was 65 when he began to walk with God, and that was also the age when Methuselah was born. This must be significant because Methuselah's name means, after him it shall come. I don't think it's much of a stretch of our imagination to realize that it is the flood. After him, the flood shall come. I wonder if it was through a vision he knew to call his son by that name. God chose him at 65 to begin his work as a prophet. That was what Lamech hated, the prophecy, and caused him to boast that he would kill him. So it was not only the prophecy of Methuselah's name, but also this prophecy in Jude that caused the conflict. Behold, the Lord cometh with 10,000 of his saints to execute judgment upon all. This obviously was not popular, particularly with Lamech, since it was most certainly aimed at him primarily. And so it was that Enoch was taken away by God to somewhere safe. By faith Enoch was translated that he should not see death, and was not found because God had translated him. The Strong defines it, transported, taken away. He was taken away so that he should not see death. But of course he did die, because as we see in verse 13, these all died in faith. But he was taken away so that he would not see death then. Let's consider Lamech's children. In verse 20 we read, And Ada bare Jabal. He was the father of such as dwell in tents, and of such as have cattle. He appears to have been a businessman, maybe a cattle baron. I wonder if God records this because he represented the worst in business. Names have significance in the Bible, so combine that with his work, and we can see the character of the man. His name means pomp and pomposity. The stereotype of the CEO who puffs himself up just because he can make money. When I said worst in business, it's because his type has total disregard for anything but profit. It can take the form of misapplication of trust, perhaps selling subprime mortgages, which ruined tens of thousands and almost caused a worldwide recession. Incidentally, they're still being sold or under a new name. Some businesses exploit people, be they workers or clients, and we all know how some industries have been a contributor to local and world pollution. Tobacco is the perfect example of big businesses which do not care. People who produce cigarettes are drug dealers. Nicotine is a drug, an upper. Plus they add chemicals to increase addictiveness, nearly half of which are harmful and 69 cause cancer. And for some reason, this is legal. The only product this business produces does not supply anything of any benefit to anybody. To these people, the love of money makes them destroyers. even selling flavoured cigarettes to children in Eastern Europe, Latin America, Africa, Asia and India, to make them addict customers for life. Go to schools in these areas, and despite legislation, there are sales outlets within 100 metres with brightly coloured packets of cigarettes, and they're mixed in with the packets of sweets. What of Jubal? He was the father of all such as handle the harp and organ. If I tell you his name means pleasure, it's a fine indication of what he represents. Jubal may have played electric guitar. That surprise you when Solomon tells us there is nothing new under the sun? By reference, we know that the root of harp is twang. It reminds me of Twain Eddy and his twangy guitar. That's a very early LP cover. What's an LP, Grandad? Notice the album cover, Twanging Up a Storm. We read that brass and iron were known in verse 22. Now, brass is an alloy of copper and zinc, therefore copper was known. Add this to wind power and iron, and you could make a simple generator, hence electricity. Far-fetched? Maybe. What I'm about to say may strengthen the claim. You and I have an average life expectancy of 70, maybe 80 years. So by the time we're 16, assuming 10 years retirement, it leaves around 50 years to gain a further education, start a career, and have a family. These guys had 17 career lifetimes before they reached 900. A period equal to the time from the Norman invasion to the 20th century. A very, very lengthy lifespan. So no wonder Tubal Cain invented what he did. He had plenty of time to gain experience and to experiment. So it wouldn't surprise me if electricity was invented back then. I recall in the late 50s when it all started as rock and roll, how American pastors in particular called it the devil's music. I don't think they believed it, but they were scared because they could see the reaction of teenagers to this music. The teenagers rebelled against the establishment, against their parents. And one way this showed itself was violence, for example, ripping up cinema seats at a showing of Rock Around the Clock. Recently I went to a recital of Handel's Messiah. As far as I could tell, there wasn't one seat vandalised, which was a surprise, because there were some very dodgy people there, particularly in the choir. Rock music excites, but is it evil? I suggest the evil is in the connections. Permissiveness and drug abuse. We know neither were invented in the 60s by any rock musician. Permissiveness goes back thousands of years, and it's on record that drugs were regularly used by musicians in the 1930s and later, and possibly earlier. Where rock is guilty was that the 60s brought these evils into the public consciousness. And I know because I was there. It was the Stones, the Rolling Stones, that made them common knowledge. It started with the drug bust that took Jagger and Richards to court, and being in possession of drugs, put them in jail. All this was headlined in the press, and once it was public knowledge, many saw the attractions. And this was when the sense of personal freedom, the rights of the individual, and hedonism re-emerged. This sense of freedom, the belief that anything goes, has worsened over the decades at an amazing rate. We don't know what happened back in the days of Jubal. However, I think it's fair to presume that what happened in this world was a reflection of what occurred 5,000 years ago. Sin is sin, and temptation is temptation. whatever the era. Jubal's name, pleasure, is what most of the world seeks and is a constant threat to our spiritual lives. It's also worth mentioning how much violence is now present in heavy rock lyrics. I've little doubt it's simply a repeat of Jubal's day, evidenced by the lyrics of his father's boast, which supposedly became a popular chant of violence. Verse 23, she also bare Tubal-Cain, an instructor of every artificer in brass and iron. Brass and iron are basic engineering metals. There is a great deal of technology involved. They're innocent. I've used them myself, however, not to build weapons. This passage in 1 Samuel is a clue describing Goliath. I won't read the highlighted parts, but you can see brass and iron are predominant in Goliath's weaponry and armour. There are no other metals mentioned in Genesis, but brass is an alloy, so there were other metals. So technology was part of Tubal-Cain's talent. These others weren't mentioned in his infantry because I presume that weaponry was his major interest. I'm guessing he became the first arms dealer, selling to anyone who wanted to start a small army. Perhaps his dad was his first customer, looking for a weapon to slaughter Enoch. I think it's fair to say that in modern times, with so many countries spending such a high percentage of their GDP on buying armaments, it leaves little in the treasuries for welfare and overseas aid to feed the poor. I've always been a firm believer that there's no reason why starvation could not be eradicated if the will was there. And we know one day swords will be beaten into plowshares and spears into pruning hooks. So we can summarise and compare. We can see quite clearly the comparisons between the past world and our own. In the antediluvian world, I put question mark against pollution, drugs and war, because as far as I can tell, there is no direct evidence. All the other evils were present in both worlds. So on the right we see the evils created by Cain, church apostasy and sin cities. Jabal, callous big business, only interested in profits at the expense of people. Jubal, representing pleasure, fornication, degenerate lives and drug dependency. And Tubal-Cain adding weapons to what was already a violent world. Very quickly, because it's only one of these QI details, but I wrote a book in 2000 entitled The Year 1000, which dealt month by month with day-to-day life, the social history, as it was in England in the year 1000. And it wasn't in Britain, it was in England. So, reading the highlights very quickly, people were lightheaded through the lack of solid food, and modern chemistry has shown that the ergot that flowered on rye as it grew mouldy was a source of lysergic acid, LSD, the cult drug of the 1960s. Poppies, hemp and darnel were scavenged, dried and ground up to produce a medieval hash brownie known as crazy bread. And down the bottom, medieval morphine, rather like the skin of frog cited in Shakespeare's witch's brew in Macbeth, which was shown to possess psychedelic properties. My guess is if our ancestors knew about drugs, I'm sure the pre-flood people did as well. We all know, as it was in the days of Noah, we realise that giving in marriage, etc., was not a sin, but the sin was that God was ignored, as he is today. That was the message, but of course we could add these global comparisons as well. What a mess. And so we come to the final character in our list of villains, Ham. Yes, Ham, Noah's son. And I realise I might have an argument over this, but it's my personal opinion. It doesn't say anywhere in the Bible that the 8 that entered the ark were saved by their righteousness. The 7 others were, I'm sure, but I doubt Ham was. As evidence, we have the sin with his father's nakedness after the flood, which begs the question, was Ham wicked before the flood, or did God simply know he wasn't God-fearing? If so, did God take him into the ark as part of his plan? We don't know the answers, of course. There's an interesting justification of me defining Ham as a villain. There's a leaflet published by the Detroit Christadelphians entitled The Miraculous Significance of Numbers and Colours as They Appear in the Holy Scriptures. It's a catchy title. Irrespective of that, it tells us as it is. In this leaflet, you can read how Jesus' name in the Hebrew adds up to 888. 8 being the number of immortality and resurrection, a new beginning. So we can see how Jesus represents resurrection and a new beginning. That's obvious, and it's the basis of our hope. We know the ark represented a new beginning and resurrection, the death of the old lives and the rebirth of the new, though obviously not to immortality. So if we add up the known names of the ark, Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, we get 936. What if we take Ham out of the equation? Well, you'd be disappointed if I didn't say 888. And of course that's exactly what the sum of the other 4 equates to. They were the only men who symbolised a new beginning, starting new lives dedicated to God. Earlier, when we were looking at the genealogy chart, I mentioned the missing names in the family tree after Jabal, Jubal and Tubal-Cain. They were the unnamed 9th and 10th generations of the line of Cain, and brings us to what I believe the final straw that brought the flood. And it came to pass, when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born to them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men that they were fair, and they took them wives of all which they chose. There were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bare children to them, the same became mighty men, which were of old, men of renown. We don't know how many of the sons of Eve turned their backs on God, but I've made a rough calculation. Assuming all the married couples had 3 children, we're looking at perhaps 250 from Enoch, and more if you add earlier generations who are still living. So 250 thereabouts deserted the right-hand side of our family tree, leaving 8 people on their own. To me, it's almost beyond comprehension how so many of the 7th, 8th and 9th generations could be seduced. And it wouldn't only be the men of God attracted by the women. I can imagine how the daughters of God were drawn to the seed of Cain. We've just read, their children became mighty men, men of renown. Also, the prosperity and pleasure the sons of Cain were enjoying was a great temptation, just as the pleasures of our modern world are a temptation to us. Either way, the number of those that abandoned God was horrifying. Can you imagine that happening in our society? I can. Hopefully, not in such great numbers. But ones I've known are into double figures. We know it's happening in various ecclesias, and will probably continue. The world tempts us with all the things that are of sinful nature. And what makes it worse? We're told it's all right. By contrast, when I was a teenager, the notion of an unmarried man and woman living together was disapproved of, not just by Christadelphians, but by society. Now society tells us it's normal. And a man and a woman, how old-fashioned. We're free, gender-free. What we've seen this evening is very negative, and if unchecked, we know it will get worse. So let's conclude with a positive message. Let's bring ourselves back to thoughts of God's existence and His power and the future under His control. We can't see Him, we can't hear Him, but we know He's here. God and His angels are working in the background as always, bringing us nearer and nearer to the time when we'll see the return of His Son. So, a short story with a tenuous connection to our subject, but with a positive message. So, warning, come to my Bible studies, you can be sure of the story. She hid and waited, knowing she'd put herself in the gravest danger. They could all be killed, not only herself, but the whole family, father, mother, and her brothers. She drew strength from her trust in her Father and His God, her God. Regardless, her body shook with apprehension, despite the gentle warmth of the morning sun on her skin. She knew the maidens always came down to the river first, spreading out along the bank, leaving the space free where their mistress came for the ritual washing each morning. At the expected time, the great doors opened, and the maids streamed out, taking up their positions. Pharaoh's daughter glided through the doorway, tall and majestic, her bare feet noiselessly following the marble walkway down to the Nile. She paused before raising her head and stretching out her arms in silent prayer to the sun, before lowering her gaze in homage to the great river god. Miriam saw the woman's surprise when she saw the small bundle floating, nesting in the semicircle that had been cut in the rushes. Miriam wasn't surprised. Despite only the moonlight, she'd carefully positioned the ark so the woman couldn't fail to notice. Pharaoh's daughter motioned to a maiden who waded through the water to retrieve the bulrush ark. While she took the small bundle from her maid, Miriam abandoned her hiding place and strode towards the jetty. When she was only a short distance away, she was relieved to see the woman's head, to see the woman's broad smile the instant she lifted the covering. She gazed down at the handsome baby. He began to weep. "This is one of the Hebrews' children," she whispered. She turned as the 10-year-old stopped beside her. She compared their features, the girl and the boy. It wasn't by chance this young girl appeared from nowhere. "Is he yours?" Miriam ignored her question and repeated the words her father had instructed. "Shall I go and call to thee a nurse of the Hebrew women, that she may nurse the child?" She paused before emphasizing the important words. "For thee?" The woman was silent, no doubt considering the proposition. If she thought she was being manipulated, did she care, having been offered this amazing gift from the Nile god? She lifted the boy from the ark and held him close. His plaintive cry ceased as she cuddled him. "Go," she hushed. While Miriam ran to fetch her mother, Pharaoh's daughter considered her father's law. No, it hadn't been broken. The child had been put in the Nile in accordance with the decree, even though it was in an ark, and placed in the shelter of the rushes so the current hadn't taken him out to sea. She held the boy at arm's length. "My son," she sighed. She looked from the bulrushes to the boy. "Moses. You'll be called Moses." Isn't it a thrill to see how God manipulates people to ensure His will is done? The Israelites were slaves, but this woman was the instrument to save God's people from her people. And today's world leaders, so-called, are being used by God. And we know, for unto us a child is born, and the government will be upon His shoulder. With God's grace, we will all, very soon, be his servants.